Energy Resources Environment Program and the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy. I'm the director of both of those things. I'm very glad to have Holly Herman Lee, who is a freelance consultant who's done extensive work with the International Finance Corporation and other sustainable finance entities. And she's going to tell us all about what's happening in sustainable finance in emerging markets. She also has a lot of experience for finding employment opportunities and projects and work in this area. So if any of the students are interested in hearing, you're more than welcome to ask questions after the talk. Please.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Johannes. So thank you for coming. I'm Holly, and let me tell you a little bit about my background. I'm a lawyer by training, and I'm from China. I come here from graduate school, and then I've been working for the IFC and the World Bank since 2006. So it's been many years. So right now, I'm working with a group called the Sustainable Banking Network, the secretariat of which is sitting in the IFC. And the Sustainable Banking Network, let's learn more about it. But before we start, I would do a quick survey. How many of you have a finance background? Can you stand up? So thank you. If I say anything that is not completely correct, please correct me anytime. And how many of you have an international background? If I say stand up, everyone will stand up. Right? How many of you are actually from emerging markets? So most students are from emerging markets. That's very, very encouraging because emerging markets is playing a bigger and bigger role in developing the world's economy. So today we're going to talk, the session will have, this talk will have 3 sections, the background, and then we're going to talk about the Sustainable Banking Network First Global Progress Report. There are some 2 pages infographic on the desk. If you have grabbed it, that would be great. So first of all, what is sustainable finance? Ooh, anyone who can tell me what is sustainable finance? The 3 students with finance background?
Well, there's a concept called SG something, I forgot.
ESG, that's correct.
Yeah, ESG investing is it's very hot recently in finance. When you invest in a company, you look at long term and see like how this company gonna survive in the future with all the climate challenge and like all the environmental challenge. So I think that's something related to that.
Exactly. So what's the difference between what makes sustainable finance so important and what makes it different from the traditional finance? So in the traditional sense, when you're financing something, what you're looking for, the holy grail is financial return. How much money can I earn? And its impact on the environment, on its community, is secondary consideration. But with sustainable finance, we value environmental and social impact as much as financial return. And yes, you can have both. Actually, recent survey and research done by the Goldman Sachs and Bank of America and a bunch of stock exchange show that companies have good environmental social governance performance, which is ESG performance, tend to have better financial performance, especially long-term performance. And their stocks are less likely to tank and they're less likely to get lawsuit. So I think that's why sustainable finance has become more and more important because people realize it is not something that is popular for now. It is something actually tangible and measurable. So how many of you are familiar with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? Yes. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Oh, well, in my last job, it was the first rule of the SDGs not to talk about them, but jokingly. But, so 2030 is the goal of it overall, and it encompasses a myriad of overarching goals followed by many more below each of them. I'm not doing it justice at all, and I'm sure you have a better definition of that.
Anyone else? I saw several hands went up just now. Come on.
Yeah, it's also a great, I suppose, starting point for governments, institutions, individuals, and businesses, just to see how they can. I guess it's a really great resource in school for these groups to see how they can be directing and planning strategically towards improve sustainability in their impact area. Multiple governments have used these to inform their various economic policies and environmental policies. So it's also a great tool, not just a unifying intention.
Exactly, they both are right, and I couldn't put it better. So what I want to point out is there are actually money involved, because if you achieve something, you need to invest. So it is estimated that every year we need 7 trillion globally to achieve the goals by 2030. So currently, all the countries combined were spending between 5 trillion, 4 trillion. So where do we find the missing 2 and 3 trillions? Well, so last month, the UN launched the Sustainable Banking Principle, and the UN Secretary General gave a very inspiring speech. The takeaway is we actually have the combined wealth globally of $300 trillion. Now picture $300 trillion in your mind in single dollar bills. And which makes $2 to $3 trillion gap to finance the sustainable development goal, not that much. Especially if we're looking at the developed country or the emerging market, compared to the banking sector in the developed country, globally, 2/3 of the finance are from the banking sector, from banks. But in emerging markets, because the financial sector infrastructure is still being built, 90% of the investment, 90% of the money that's going to go to support the SDG achievements are going to come from banks. That's why the banking sector is crucial. And in emerging markets, is there a pointer here? Never mind. So the banks host about 50 trillion assets, and they're responsible for 90% of investment in the emerging market. Just keep that in mind. So now let's talk about the sustainable banking network. Now you know banking sector is very important. The banking sector in emerging markets is crucial. So what are we doing to help the banking sector fulfill their duty to support the sustainable development goals? So 7 years ago, 10 countries, this 10 on the left, are the government, the financial sector regulators get together and decide we're going to do something. And then that's when they founded the Sustainable Banking Network. And in Sustainable Banking Network, initially, our members care about 2 things. One is environmental social risk management. How can we limit the harm that is done by our investments? And the second is green finance flow. How can we maximize our impact? How can we encourage more capital flow to the sectors and industries that will benefit environmental and social and contribute to the SDGs and climate change? Now, 7 years later, the Sustainable Banking Network has 53 members from 38 countries. And we represent collectively 43 trillion in banking assets, which is 86% of all banking assets in emerging markets. So this is a really big network. And as you can see, the countries are different color. The green ones are the countries that has their national sustainable finance policies or principles. For example, China's green credit policy, Brazil's green protocol. And when the SBN was founded in 2012, only 2 countries have national sustainable finance policy. And by July 2019, we have 22. And actually in August 2019 alone, 2 more countries has joined the rank to have their own sustainable finance policy, which are Thailand and Ghana. And this is very important. And why do all the financial regulators, central banks, and financial associations come to IFC? They didn't go to the UN, not the World Bank. Why IFC? So it's because we have the IFC's performance standard. One of the handouts are on the IFC performance standards. So who has read it and can tell me a little bit, tell everyone a little bit about what is IFC performance standard? This is a reading test, apparently. Anyone? Okay. So basically, IFC is an international development bank, and it only invests in projects and private sector projects and companies in emerging markets. So in order to make sure IFC's investment doesn't generate harm or to just avoid controversies being sued by NGOs, IFC project goes through a very strict environmental and social due diligence screening. And this is the tool they use, the performance standards. It has 8 standards covering from the overall risk, environmental, social risk management requirements for their client or the project they're about to invest to 6 different, no, actually 7 different specific areas of risk. And IFC performance is also the cornerstone of Equator Principles. Who are familiar with Equator Principles? So it is a voluntary principle adopted by most 93 or 103 international investment banks. The banks basically similar to the responsible investment principle. They commit to follow certain principles or guidelines when they do large project investment. So because this is the international best practice and standards for environmental and social risk management, and that is why the SBM members choose IFC to host their secretary. So we see a little shrimp at the corner, which means we're going to do a case study. Imagine now you are a financial advisor. Excuse me, I'm not very familiar with the case, and this is my first time doing it. So imagine you're a financial advisor, and one of your friends say, "Hey, I find a really, really good investment opportunity. You have to come to Ecuador with me." So you went to, because you trust your friend, you hop on the flight, you go to Ecuador. It's a beautiful country, full with iguanas, apparently shrimps. So you're meeting the representative from Yummy Bank from Ecuador, because shrimp is yummy, and the bank is a private local bank. And then they offer you a fantastic exclusive investment opportunity for one of the shrimp farms that will develop the state-of-art shrimp farms. Why are you investing in shrimp, you ask? Because there's a huge surge for shrimp demand from China. Think about that. Chinese people eat over 100 million tons of pork every year. If they only eat 1% of that shrimp, we're going to be very rich. So what do you think if we invest in a shrimp farm? I even found a wetland at the foot of this mountain that's perfect to be turned into ponds, and then we can start farm shrimps. So as a responsible advisor, you think social due diligence. So I'm not an agricultural expert. I know very little about shrimp farms, but if we go back, take the shrimp farm idea, and we apply to these 8 standards, I need 8 students. Each can tell me your idea how, when you're looking at the shrimp farm proposal, to think about how each standard will apply in your investment process. Anyone would like to start?
I think biodiversity is the most obvious one, because we have to make sure that as you farm the shrimps, you make sure that the new wetlands that you will use are not farming shrimps in those wetlands are not going to affect the different animals or plants in the wetlands that already existed, and it's not going to change the ecosystem in that area. So that's
excellent. Any fellow advisors?
also when think about communities. Since I'm going to build a shrimp farm there will be a bunch of other business in the same area, and local people's going to be hired by these companies, and how it's going to impact the local people, and also how the rent's going to go up. Would it have a negative effect on people's living quality in there? So I'll take that into consideration too.
Very good.
I would say land resettlement, because obviously you're going to need some space, right? And you're going to be changing how it's going to affect the environment. You're going to move people around, or what's going to happen to the area, land use.
Exactly.
You're changing the land use. How's that going to impact on the overall environment?
Fantastic.
I think risk management. So we're making a lot of these changes, assuming that the demand is going to come from China. and we're kind of equating that they consume as much shrimp as they do pork. But in case they don't, then we've kind of made significant changes to our land, to our communities with uncertain demand. So I'd want to assess that.
And that is financial risk management.
Financial, yeah.
Perfect. Anyone wants to talk about environmental and social risk management? So the easy one has already been covered, right? So we still have labor, resource efficiency, that should be an easy one. Indigenous people and cultural heritage, they're harder, so let me cover those two. So as you know, Ecuador has a lot of indigenous people. They live there for centuries. You cannot pay them out. They refuse to leave. So it is always a very sensitive issue because it's a very sensitive equality issue. So when you do an investment, you have to make sure you have many dialogue with indigenous people. And if you replace them, if you resettle them, you have to make sure it's a free informed prior consent. So you have to do a lot of stakeholder engagement and education. And you want to make sure they're better off after than before. And cultural heritage is something that it can be a stone. It could be the lake itself could be a sacred land, you don't know. So once you run into cultural heritage, you cannot start digging without doing a lot of consultation. And okay, so we now have risk management, which means, so the shrimp farm that you're investing in has to have its own risk management system. They have to have a good labor practice, have to have a good resource management practice, they have to have a good community connection practice. So basically all the 2 to 8 the standards have to embed it in the shrimp farm itself, its own internal policy and procedure. It has to have policy for supervision, monitoring, reporting, and grievance address, meaning.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you, because I'm just thinking this whole process and also the evaluation is pretty much sales enforcement. So is there going to be a third party who is looking at this and tell the financial advisor, oh, this is good or not, or the financial advisor is just doing it out of goodwill?
That's a really good question. So in the World Bank and IFC, we have a role called the environmental social specialist. So the specialists, we don't do numbers. We don't calculate the financial risk or the financial availability. We do exactly that. We look at all the projects and filter them, look at them with the standard performance lens to see whether it's possible the project can be done. For example, if you look at a project in the middle of indigenous people's land, the chances it's not going to work. Or if you're looking for a project that has a lot of resettlement, if it's a dam, then it's a lot of resettlement, it's a lot of biodiversity issue, so the chance is higher. So risk assessment, that's why risk management is the first on the list. You need to assess the risk before you start digging into it. We still haven't covered labor and resource efficiency.
So like you touch labor, but this is very complex. So thoughts I started mapping out a little bit was, first off, you got to ensure that there's going to be a non-discrimination policy in place, and that needs to include LGBT, and in addition to that, gender, and with the specific gender lens, depending on where you're, well, in Ecuador even, that there is a plan for equitable representation of women within the labor force as well. Other thoughts that came to mind was safety overall, and then when I started thinking about safety, it also reminded me of different things around the world where going to and from work is part of the, one of the most dangerous part of the day, and so having a full picture of that, and where your labor force is and who they are, it's gonna be very important, and then not only who they are but how they're employed.
Thank you. And another thing to add, child labor.
Yes, there's much, yeah,
Yes.
and
But you're on the right track. So basically, this is all the things you have to go through in your mind, whether there's possibility for union, whether it has any written documents, whether the employment is short-term. If I get pregnant, can they lay me off? So the last one, resource efficiency. Okay, what can you do too?
If you introduce too many shrimps into the wetlands, for example, that can deplete the nutrients in the wetlands. In the short term, you can produce a lot of shrimp, but in the long term, all the nutrients that the shrimp would need to survive would be depleted. So maybe 10 years later, no shrimp can survive in that like waters. So it's important to look at that.
Exactly, and how much water they use every batch, and what do they do with the wastewater, etc. So thank you very much for your very wise advice. So before we go into our further discussion of the case study, we're going to talk about the Global Progress Report. So everyone should have that. So as a lawyer, first of all, disclaimer, whatever we talk about here represent the finding of the Sustainable Banking Network, not IFC or World Bank official opinion. And also this report is intended to focus on national level policy, and we're not going out to capture the innovation and practice of the private sector financial institutions in this country. So that's done. And this report, we found one thing that is very significant. The first significant finding we have is all countries across income spectrum are doing sustainable finance. As you can see, the dark green are the upper middle income countries like China, Colombia, Brazil, Indonesia, and the light green are the lower income and IDA countries like Cambodia, Kenya, Ghana, and the last one is a combined. As you can see, the development of sustainable finance policy in lower middle and higher middle country, they basically go hand in hand. Sometimes one is higher and the other is higher. This tells a story of determination and opportunity. Even though in lower income countries, IDA countries, the government usually have lower capacity, the market structure is usually more fragmented, but because of the need, because of two things, the IDA countries are still doing really good and catching up with the upper income country in terms of finance, sustainable finance policy environment. One is need, because the poorest countries are usually the vulnerable countries. So they are being affected by disaster the most. So they have a strong push from the society to develop a sustainable finance policy. And second, just imagine that if you're drawing a picture on a piece of paper that already have a blueprint, it's really hard to draw what you want. But if you're drawing a picture on a paper that's relatively empty, it's easier to sketch what you have in mind because there are less interest groups, there are less pushbacks. So that is actually having a market that's under development is actually an advantage and disadvantage for lower income countries when they develop sustainable finance. So another thing that this report comes out is the sustainable banking, the SBN measurement framework. So this framework has 3 pillars. As we talk about sustainable finance, 2 big chunks: environmental social risk management and the green finance flow. And above these 2 big chunks, we have an overarching enabling environment. So it's basically what's the policy environment in this country, what's the interagency collaboration, and what is the enforcement ability. And this is actually an outstanding achievement in our mind, because this framework is developed and agreed upon by all, back then it's 34 country members. And you know how hard it is to have 34 countries sit together and agree on something. And this is not just a qualitative measurement. This actually is a quantitative measurement. As you can see, there are indicators under each pillar, and each indicator is actually a yes or no question. For example, does your country's policy require financial institutions to have environmental social risk management policy? Does your policy require regular disclosure of their environmental social performance? Does your policy set up a specific program or initiative to encourage green finance? And then based on the actual score calculating from this calculation, so here is the calculation. So the risk side is environment social risk management. And you, for example, say the imaginary country has 80 points from the risk ESRM pillar. and 70 points from the green finance flow pillar. So in this calculation, risk is 70% of the total score, opportunity is 40% of the total score. Then who is good at math?
Sorry, say that again. That should have
So the imaginary country has 80 points from the risk side and 70 points from the opportunity side. So what would the score here be?
80 times 60 plus 70 times 40?
Yes.
40%?
Yes.
Oh, you want?
How many is it?
Okay.
Okay.
6, 7, 6, 8.
Yes, at the 70s, right? And then the multiplier is how well the policy infrastructure, the implementation mechanism, and the collaboration environment is in this country. So how well this well-designed policy is actually going to be implemented. Let's say it's a social country, so it's 1. So the score of this country would be 70-something. And where does it place it in this 5 circles, which we call the progression metrics? It's called the progression metrics because the development of sustainable finance and the implementation of it is not a one-off activity. It's a progress. It's like a journey. Everyone starts from here, and then you kind of take your journey from initiative all the way to mature. And in the report, basically, we have first developed the measurement framework. And then we work with the EY, the Ernst Young is a big consultant firm, to collect all the policy documents from our member country. Back then, this research is done in June 2017. 15 countries have already issued their national sustainable finance policy. So we collected all the documents. We have an in-depth desktop review. We interview our members to verify their policy, to verify their implementation. We have group discussions to see how the policy language fit into the framework, the yes or no question. And then we calculated the score like we just did, and we use the score and we consider whether the policy is actually being implemented. And if it's being implemented, is it being tracking, or has the market has reacted positively to the policy? And then we place them in the maturity stage in the progression metrics. And as a result, we have one global aggregated report, which the summary of which you already have, and 15 country report. After the 15, we have the consent to publish 10 reports. So let's take a deeper look into the measurement framework. So we talk about there are 3 big pillars: the enabling environment, the managing environmental and social risk management, and encouraging and checking the green finance flow. So here are the definition of each 3 pillars. I want 3 friends to read this out loud who have not spoken yet.
The enabling environment pillar assesses cross-cutting factors that have been shown to have a multiplying or undermining effect in achieving the first 2 pillars.
Can you think of an example what is an enabling environment?
Published history in an investing company that has been known to take extreme risks in investments that have also proven to damage the environment.
So that is example of the history enabling environment of the financial institute. And at this pillar we're looking at, because it's a policy, we're looking at the enabling environment of the country. So what you said could be translated whether the financial institutions in this country have particularly aggressive investment strategy as a culture, whether they are likely to disregard environmental law or find loopholes in them. Okay, now who will be the second volunteer?
You want me to read it first?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. The ENS risk management pillar assesses the degree to which national policies or principles provide comprehensive and in-depth guidance and requirements to financial institutions in managing E&S risks, including climate risk, and the extent to which this guidance is applied by financial market participants.
Can you think of an example?
A government policy which like ties how much money or contracts they're willing to have with the company in exchange for monitoring their environmental footprint.
So that's a good example. So, because if a company or financial institution is devoted to conduct environmental and social risk management, what they need to do is devote resources to it. So whether the policy explicitly require resources dedication, whether it's staff, money, or other resources to the environmental social risk management, is part of the measurement. Thank you. And the last one, I'm going to call on people if no one volunteers.
The green finance flows pillar assess the degree to which market infrastructure has been introduced to encourage financial institutes to direct their lending to projects and businesses with positive environmental and climate impacts and resulting impacts on capital flows.
Thank you. Can you think of an example? So green bond would be a good example, whether the country has a green bond initiative, a green bond policy. So as we just gathered the example, so these are the 3 multipliers for the enabling environment pillar. So the first multiplier is implementation mechanism. So how do the country going to implement this policy once it's launched or issued? They're actually, if you look at the SBM members, majority, I want to say maybe 2/3 of them are financial sector regulators, and 1/3 of them are actually banking associations. If a central bank or a banking regulatory commission issue an environmental social risk management policy, then the banks have to respond, have to comply because it's regulatory. But what happens if a banking association issue, say, the Brazil Banking Association issue the Brazil Green Protocol? What happened? Actually, in Ecuador, this is exactly the case. So the Ecuadorian Private Bank Association in 2006, listen because it's related to your case study, issued the Ecuador Sustainable Banking Protocol. It is a voluntary protocol because banking associations cannot make the banks do things. So what do? They make the banks sign up for the commitment, just like the signatories of the UN Principle of Responsible Investment. So they make the bank commit of doing it. They have a huge ceremony. All the CEO of the banks line up, take pictures, and then they put a picture on the news, on their website, and the pictures say like, oh, our bank is doing great for the environment. And then the public is going to hold the banks responsible. So there are many different enforcement mechanisms. And then the second one is policy infrastructure. So if there is a standalone sustainable finance, say a green bond policy, if it's a standalone policy,
Yeah, sorry. So that example that you just had, is that an example of the green bond, like similar to a green bond, or I wasn't sure what example that was for.
Sorry, you mean the
Like having the public hold them accountable.
Okay, that is the first one, implementation mechanism. Because in Ecuador, the Green Banking Protocol is issued by the banking association. If Yummy Bank decided, I don't want to listen to banking association, I don't want to do sustainable finance, screw environmental impact, I'm going to do this. The banking association cannot fine them because they don't have the regulatory authority to do that. What the banking association do is they take out the picture, look, the Yummy Bank as CEO is here, they signed the commitment to protect the environment. Now they're violating it. What should we do? So they turn the customer against it, and then maybe the local people will start suing the bank. So they rely on the society as a whole to enforce the protocol.
So the ability that you can do that goes into what score the multiplier gets? Is that what it is?
Not necessarily. It's a consideration. For example, China has the green bond, has the green credit policy. It's issued by the regulator, so we know Chinese regulator has iron fist. So they probably score pretty high in implementation mechanism. But say, I'm just trying to think. Say an imaginary country, it is the banking association. Everyone signs the protocol, but the banking association is a very loose organization. They don't provide trainings. They don't produce annual reports about their banks. So their member banks are less likely to be held responsible to what they have committed. Thank you. So I'm done now.
Just a question regarding the bank regulation. So, in what condition would a bank violate ESG requirement developed by the regulation? Because it's simply a financial institution that require the banks to do due diligence before investing in certain projects, which will later have negative social impact to the economy.
Right.
What you're referring to?
Yes.
Okay.
So your question is why would the banks comply?
I mean, why? I'm just like sort of understanding the scenario of how bank would be subject to the environment, how the business that bank conducted would be would cause adverse impact to the environment or like, social environment and stuff.
Thank you. That is a really good question. It's a perfect segue to my next slides. The slides after this. So this is how does the policy make the banks to regulate the environmental social management? So basically, there are several things the bank are required to do, or in an ideal world, required to do to make sure their investments make sure their investments doesn't produce a lot of harm for the environmental and social. So because you asked the question, do you mind just reading the bold ones?
Sure. Environmental social risk policy is required to formalize.
Come closer.
It is required to formalize an ES risk management policy. We have governance, capacity, risk assessment, project supervision, portfolio review, and disclosure.
Thank you. So all these things are the things that the financial institutions are supposed to do to meet the environmental social risk management requirements. Not all the countries have all these requirements in their policy, and that is why we score them. So as you can see, we have 5 different pillars, and we map all these indicators under these 5 pillars. We have the first one is environmental risk policy, whether the national policy require the banks to have their own internal environmental social policy. And then we have governance, whether the bank's policy is issued by the board, whether the board will be held responsible for the performance, and who in the senior management is responsible for overseeing the practice of environmental social risk management. We have capacity, whether there is training conducted regularly for the management and for operational officers. We have risk assessment. So we just talk about how do we categorize risk? Is it a big risk, small risk? How do we assess the risk? And how are the risks? How do we plan to reduce the risk mitigation? And then we also have then under monitoring, so project supervision. Remember, everything here are done by the bank. So the supervision you mentioned, how does the banking regulator know the banks are doing what they say they are doing? Those are government supervisions, and these are banking supervisions. So if Yummy Bank invests in the shrimp farm, then the Yummy Bank once in a while, ideally twice a year, would send someone to the shrimp farm and take a look to make sure they're not using child labor, to make sure they're having a good relationship with the community. So this is project supervision. And then we also have portfolio review. That means the Yummy Bank has to look to look at all its investments, its entire portfolio to see, oh, we have 30% in energy, 20% in transportation, 5% in green building, and all across our portfolio, the proper environmental and social risk management are being conducted. And then last but not least is disclosure. So the bank have to collect their information and put it in their annual report. They either report to the regulator directly, or they report to the banking association, or they just put on their website. And as the color bar are the countries that have already that have coverage of this particular requirement, and the empty ones that are countries that have the policy, but that policy doesn't cover these particular indicators.
I'm sorry. And are these indicators, when you're like looking at it, assessing a country and assigning points, is it a yes or no question, or do you look at like, yes, there's supervision, but is it like a strict supervision, or the person just goes there, like does nothing and comes back? Like, how do you mitigate for that?
That's a very good question. So these are all paper reviews, and whether the person actually do that is another issue, and then we're going to address that in our next report. I see a shrimp here, but I think we talk about it. And then here is the green finance flow pillar. This is very important because a lot of this is talking about how to fill the 2 to 3 trillion gaps for SDGs. How can we encourage more investment to the financials, to the climate sector, to the green sectors? Is anyone volunteer to read this?
So the core indicators are notable initiatives. There are policy-led or industry-led initiatives to mobilize green financing flows and encourage innovation. Financial incentives, significant financial incentives are in place, such as subsidies, low interest rates, and extra. Sectors and projects. Green sectors and projects are properly defined through a commonly recognized definition. Data collection. It is strongly suggests to collect green finance data, including environmental benefits. Guidance. Reporting templates and or guidance are provided.
Thank you. So as you see, the different core indicators are here, and it's very obvious the countries are not doing as good under the green finance flow compared to the ESRM. And that is why the next report, we'll just jump here. We have a green bond report which address part of the green finance flow, because we're trying to encourage more countries to issue green bonds. And then you can find the 2-pager for the green bond report in the material I just hang out. I think we're running out of time, but I want to talk about, so these are the scoring, and I want to talk a little bit about this is the progression metrics. As I mentioned, everything is a journey. So when a country decided to embark in this journey, they will first join the SBN. As soon as they join the SBN, they make a promise, they make a commitment to develop a national sustainable finance policy. And currently, we have 18 countries under the initiative committing stage. As soon as they join, if they don't have a policy, they're under the initiating stage. And then formative, which is Ecuador, our very important country. Why is it informative? It's back in 2017. They have already issued a policy in 2016. However, there is a grace period. The banking association say, I know you signed up, and I know this is difficult. So you only have to start implementing this 18 months or 24 months after you've signed it. So at the time we do the assessment, it has the policy, but it has not started implementation yet. Therefore, it's formative. And then in the emerging stage, we have 6 countries, and this country have the policy, they have started implementing it. And then what's the difference between established and emerging? Those 8 countries on the established stage, not only they start implementing the policy, they have better supporting system, they have guidelines, toolkits, and they also have started collecting information for the actual implementation by the financial sector. And the mature stage, what we are hoping to see is behavior change. So after several years of implementation, monitoring, and reporting, there is an observable change in behavior from the financial sector. There is an increase in their financial flow to the green sector, and majority of their project and investment are green. This report, we don't have it, but spoil alert, in the new report, we have a few countries that has moved to the mature stage. Yes.
So do you have any sort of metrics that indicate how much of a country's investment is actually going towards these sustainable or socially responsible investments? Because like for Brazil, for instance, you know, a lot of what the president is currently doing really isn't considered environmentally sustainable or socially responsible at all, but they're under the established stage. So I'm curious, like, what the metrics are around that, or if you can calculate what percentage of the actual investments that the financial sector is doing go towards this.
That is a really good question. So, and that is actually the difference between the first report and the second report. In the first report, we only look at the policies that you should do it. Then we said, oh, it's a yes for the indicator. And in addition to that, the Brazil Banking Association, BABA, they are actually collecting data of the bank's percentage of green flow. So they're implementing it, they're collecting it, so they're in established stage. And also what the president is doing is not what the financial sector is doing. So we want to draw that distinguish. And in the second report, I think if you're interested in Brazil, FALABAN, the Latin America Regional Federation of Banking Association Banks, they have issued a study of sustainable investment from the banking sector in Brazil. I can send Professor Johannes the link, and then he can distribute. It's a really, really good policy. It's a really, really good report, and it breaks down the investment in different sectors, and that has the hard number you're looking at. So what's next? So we talk about this very exciting report we're going to come up in the next few weeks. And then we also are working on an IDA report. As we know, the developing country, especially the least developing country, are going to get hit the hardest. So we're going to help them more. We're going to see what they're doing. And any question about the slides or the shrimp story? Anyone wants to know how the shrimp story ends?
Yeah.
So there was actually a case brought to my friend who is an investor. It was 10 years ago, though. So they went through all the environmental and social due diligence. But what happened is actually Chinese people are eating a lot of shrimp. They've always been eating a lot of shrimp. But in that year, there was an epidemic of shrimp in China and Indonesia. So it wiped out all the shrimp populations. That is why they started importing shrimp from Latin America. That is why Ecuador saw a surge of shrimp demand. But you know, just like the mad cow, the disease come and the disease go. So because of this information, the investor advisor decided this demand for shrimp in Ecuador is not going to sustain. So it's not a financially viable investment. So they didn't do it. And the story of here is sustainable investment is an investment. You have to be environmental and socially sustainable, and you have to be financially sustainable. And that's all. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah. Well, I just have one quick question about the mature states. You just talked about, you say, hopefully with all of this the regulations in place, one day, like the financial institution will enter like a self-sustainable cycle. They don't need like extra investment from the government to like sustain this cycle. So I was just wondering, like, how is it possible? Because financial sector by nature is profit seeking. So like, why would these people want to invest more money to do these surveys and to make sure they can satisfy all these requirements?
This is actually a very good question, and this is a representative of a lot of misconception of what sustainable investment is. Actually, in the real world, if your project has an environmental problem, you're going to lose money down the road. So, for example, if you accidentally cure a person in your site, lawsuit is never going to end. or if you produce too much waste, you're going to get fined, and you're also going to get negative publicity. So, and I think enough evidence from the banking sectors, the Goldman Sachs and the Bank of America, they have gathered enough evidence that actually, if you take care of environmental and social risk management upfront enough, your financial return is actually going to come. There is a caveat, it's economy of scale. For bigger projects, it is worth it to do an extensive environmental social due diligence. And maybe for smaller projects, it's not, and that is okay, because smaller projects tend to have smaller environmental social impacts. And for the mature stage, we're looking at behavior change, including the allocation of funds to the greener sector. Actually, China, I think back in 2006, and looking at the banking portfolio, only 6 or 7% of the bank's lending are going to quote-unquote green sectors. And now in 2012, in 2019, they're actually 10%. And you can see a steady increase of lending percentage going to going to climate investment and green investment.
Thank you.
When you say sustainable finance, you're actually seeing that finance for the sustainability of social and environmental concerns, right? It's not the pure, as you mentioned, for the Ecuador shrimp case, the finance, like the cash flow sustainability, right?
It's both. You have to be both, right? If you're doing an investment, you have to be both.
Right. I mean, like in the context of
yes,
your work,
context,
it's only
yes.
like ESG sustainability.
Yes.
Okay. Is that something that you consider necessary for the project to be invested? I mean, do you also what comes first? Is it the financial cash flow, or all the sort of the structuring finance perspective be considered first, or the ESG sustainability BSS first in terms of whether IFC would actually invest in that project?
So usually, of course, finance comes first. Even in IFC, we pride ourselves in good practice in environmental social management, but our investment officers are the first to discover potential projects. And once they have enough discussion with client, they decide is this financially viable, and then they bring attention to the environmental and social specialist, and then they start going through the performance standards lens to see whether this project. So to see whether we can minimize any of the negative impacts. If we can avoid or minimize the impact, then yes, we can invest to the project. If the project has great financial return, but there are unavoidable huge environmental social damage, the IFC won't do it. Maybe some other investors will, but we won't. Thank you.
So how does the IFN make their investments? So are businesses from, say, member countries allowed to directly approach the IFN, or do they get, is there some mechanism that you apply from some institution from your country to IFN, or can businesses directly reach out to IFN?
International Finance Corporation,
yeah.
IFC. So
IFC, sorry.
So IFC is, so you all know World Bank.
Right.
And IFC and World Bank are actually under the bigger umbrella of World Bank Group. So World Bank Group is a product of the post-World War II division of power. So we have the UN, who is in charge of humanity action. We have the IMF, which is in charge of currency. And we have the World Bank, which is in charge of general development. And yes, probably it's general construction and development. And then the World Bank, the difference between World Bank and IFC is World Bank works exclusively with governments. We lend money, World Bank doesn't lend money to companies. They lend money to the Minister of Finance, they lend money to the Central Bank of Ethiopia. And then the Central Bank of Ethiopia, the Minister of Finance in Ecuador, they decide what project they want to fund. And then maybe they will lend money to the other banks or other projects. That IFC works directly with the private sector. So we work with local banks or even projects. We have all kinds. I think we might have a shrimp farm project, but not in Ecuador. So what happened is we have local office. We have office in, I would say, 147 countries. And the local office usually help us identify potential projects in the country. Yes, a company can reach out to the local office in the country, and then if the investment officer IO there think this is possible, and then they will bring it to they will work with the sector specialist to evaluate possibility of feasibility of this project. And once again they think it's okay, and then they will involve the environmental social specialist. And all these as IFC has an internal process like this thing, because everything has to be follow a very strict selection process. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
From the green finance perspective, how does IFC manage a fossil fuel project, and how do you see the difference between the coal, gas, and all? So do you have any?
This is hard. I will try my best. Again, disclaimer, this is only my personal view. It doesn't represent the institutional perspective. I think coal is actually in, so IFC has an exclusion list. So everything under the exclusion list, we don't finance. We have, excluding the nuclear is in the exclusion list, weaponry, tobacco, palm oil. I think coal mine is borderline. Coal mine and oil are borderline. And one of the reasons is because we're trying to push the frontier market. We're trying to invest in the project that has the most potential, but no one is willing to fund. But usually coal and other energy sources, it's easy for them to find funding. Does that answer your question?
How about gas, natural
gas? Yes, natural gas. I think we have a few natural gas, but they are usually in a further away region, or they are employing an innovative technology to extract the gas. But otherwise, natural gas is also, it's easy for them to find funding anywhere, somewhere else.
Just as an extension, so if you throw in renewables to this question, so it's going to be ranked higher by the IFC. You consider coal and oil, and then natural gas. So natural gas seems to have higher preference because it's more friendly to the environment. So if renewables are thrown into the equation,
yes,
is that going to rank far higher than natural gas?
Yes, we have a lot of renewable projects.
Okay.
So are you working strictly with banking, like banks? Because you have the concept of, I think NBFCs, so non-banking financial corporations.
Mm-hmm.
So I think when you speak about green bonds, they might be
yes, that's
one
correct.
kind of.
So for Sustainable Banking Network, we work with banking sector. But for IFC, we actually have different departments. And we have the banking sector, we call them the financial sector, right? And then we also make investment in real sectors. We have roads, we have bridges, we have agricultural farms, we have all that. And if I remember the taxonomy right, so it is capital markets, and then capital markets have it's parallel to the banks, and bond is non-bank financials, as you mentioned, but it's within the capital markets. And then we have a different branch for banks, because banks is its own big sector.
So if a NBFC is offering a bond, they won't fall within this. They fall out of this network, this specific.
Yes. This specific network, we don't issue bonds. We work with the regulator of the bonds.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Can you speak to your work with refugees as a whole, and how do they fit into, and can they fit into this framework?
So refugees is actually a really good question. I personally don't have much experience, but I think refugees might fall into, I'm trying to look for the slides, either community, and if the refugees are indigenous people, under indigenous people.
They have to cross border to be considered refugee.
So,
yeah.
So because this is a project based, so if it happened that there's for example, there's a lot of refugees congregated in the area which they develop a farm,
sure.
Then it would be considered community.
So they would need to essentially fall under whatever the government's, yeah, okay.
Yes, because immigration is a
but yeah. And so that, I mean, most of them are not recognized, they're not allowed to work, and so they're not really going to be impacted by this. There's not a.
I think it's,
a
yeah,
mechanism.
it's the other way around. This is not gonna be impacted a lot by the refugee.
Within the enabling environment that you're speaking of, does it take into account the recognition of refugees and their right to work and non-development, stuff like that?
I think at this point it's not. But I don't think I think IFC has some work on that, but World Bank, I think, has a bigger push on the refugee activities.
They're doing stuff with the UNHCR, but that's the, I mean, their data and stuff like that.
Probably
But
more
it's,
familiar than I am.
oh,
Thank you.
yes, ma'am.
So because most of the member countries are emerging markets or like developing countries, I feel like the investment in science and technology is less in those countries only because the government cannot invest a lot compared to US and other developed countries. So how does like SBN have a framework to support science and technology to like innovate new like renewables or other projects like products that can help achieve SDGs?
So we don't directly deal with that, but if it is an initiative that if the government has an initiative that encourage funding to renewable energy related research, that will help their score in the green flow section.
Okay, so that like falls to the government, so
Right,
not the
exactly.
SBN.
I know that AFC also provide advisory work. I know that AFC also provide advisory to local business or government, right?
Advisory?
Like consulting or
Oh.
provide advice to like how you can improve your business or your structure of governance, stuff like that. Is that part of like you also offer advice to the government, like in terms of how they can make better ESG policy or how you can change your local governance?
Yes, that's exactly what we do, and this is exactly what SBN does. So an IFC has, World Bank does a lot of that. So IFC does a little bit of that. We call it creating enabling environment for IFC investments, because if the country has the more strict environmental and social risk management requirements and is closer to IFC's performance standard, it kind of levels the playing field.
One last question.
Okay.
Are the policies for these countries publicly available?
Oh, yes. All the policy of this country, I'm sorry, I should stay in the last page. So if you go to the Sustainable by Finance Network website, it's www.ifc.org/SBN, which are sold in your brochure. I think you can find a list of all our member countries. I think somewhere there you can find their policy. And we are launching a new website which will have all the policies linked there.
Okay.
Not promise they're all English though.
Okay.
All right, wonderful. Well, let's thank Colin for it.